I don't think I did anything wrong. I just wanted to feel wanted again. It was one hotel meeting, one afternoon. But now my husband's lawyer has my name on a document that says, Petitioner Mark Delane. Before we dive deeper into the story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible stories. I'm Iris Valen, and I don't think I did anything wrong. I just wanted to feel wanted again. That's not a crime, right? People make it sound like I burned down a house when all I did was meet someone for coffee. A hotel coffee, technically, but still coffee. My husband, Mark, barely noticed me anymore. We lived like co-workers who happened to share a mortgage and a kid. I tried to fix things. I dressed up, planned dinners, even suggested counseling. He said we were fine, but fine isn't living. So when Evan, my ex from before everything got dull, started messaging me again, I let him. He reminded me who I was before I became this quiet version of myself. When he said he'd be in town, I thought meeting him once would give me closure. I told myself it wasn't cheating if nothing happened, but something did. Something small, human, stupid. And now Mark isn't speaking to me. He doesn't yell, doesn't accuse. He just moves with this terrifying calm. This morning, a courier handed me a thick envelope with my name printed neatly on the front. I still don't understand how it got this far. That morning, the house felt too quiet, too empty, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. Mark sat at the kitchen table, scrolling through his tablet, silent and methodical as always. I kept glancing at him, hoping for some spark of engagement, some sign that he noticed me beyond the chores and routine. He didn't look up. He never did any more unless he had to. I made coffee, the aroma filling the small kitchen, and tried to start a conversation about the new client downtown. He nodded politely, didn't ask questions. I told myself it was fine, that I could be patient, that I could fill the silence with my own energy until he remembered how to be present. When he left for work, the house felt emptier than ever. I checked my phone, Evan's name blinking on the screen. He'd texted last night, asking if I was free to meet for coffee downtown. I hesitated, staring at the message. One coffee couldn't hurt, I told myself. It was just a meeting, a chance to talk about old times, to feel seen again. At the hotel, Evan was waiting, smiling like no time had passed. I told myself this was harmless. We talked about work, old friends, the city skyline. His hand brushed mine at one point, barely noticeable, but I felt it all the same. I didn't pull away. I told myself it was nothing, just a reminder that I existed outside the walls of monotony. When I got home, Mark was already there, quiet and precise. He made dinner, set the table neatly, and kept his mug on the counter opposite mine. I asked casually about his day. He gave measured answers. I laughed at his politeness, tried to lighten the mood, but he just smiled faintly, calm, unreadable. Later, I noticed the guest room light on. Through the slightly open door, Mark was moving papers through a scanner. I froze, realizing he was documenting, noting, recording without confrontation. I told myself it didn't matter, that it was just organization. But the faint hum of the printer, the click of a drawer lock, the neat arrangement of folders all carried weight I could not ignore. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the hotel, Evan's attention, and Mark's quiet vigilance. The mugs on the counter, the sticky notes, the spreadsheets. They weren't just habits anymore. They were signs, and I realized, even as I told myself I was clever, that Mark's calm observation was preparing something far bigger than I could see. The morning after that meeting, I woke up with this dull, guilty ache in my chest. It wasn't fear exactly, more like the kind of heaviness that comes from knowing you've done something small that might grow into something big. Mark was already gone again. He'd left early, as usual. His side of the bed looked perfect, the blanket smooth, the pillow barely touched. On the nightstand sat his mug from last night, clean and dry. I stared at it for a long time, wondering when we'd stopped sharing mornings. Downstairs, the house felt staged, like someone had been tidying up for guests who never arrived. His shoes were lined up neatly by the door, keys hanging in their proper place, his jacket on the hook facing outward. He's always been like that, careful, precise. But lately, it feels less like order and more like distance disguised as cleanliness. I made coffee, but the smell turned my stomach. I checked my phone. Nothing from Evan, which was good. I didn't need messages to keep the memory alive. Still, part of me expected something. A text, a small check-in, a sign that he was thinking about me. When nothing came, I told myself that was better. That meant it wasn't an affair, just a mistake. At work, the day dragged. My co-workers chatted about weekend plans, about the marketing event next month. I kept half listening, half drifting into thought. I replayed the hotel scene in my head, but the details were blurry already. Maybe I wanted them blurry. I convinced myself that meant it hadn't really mattered. Around noon, Clara called. My sister always picks the worst times. She asked how things were with Mark, and I told her the same thing I always say, fine. She asked if we'd gone on that weekend trip we'd talked about. I said we were both too busy. She hesitated, then said she'd seen a post of me tagged at the hotel yesterday. I froze. Someone must have snapped a picture, maybe when I walked in. I laughed it off, said it was work-related. She didn't sound convinced. She said something about how little things add up, that Mark didn't deserve more distance. I told her she was being dramatic, that she should focus on her own relationship. Before she could respond, I ended the call. That night, Mark came home early. I heard his car pull in just as I was pouring a glass of wine. I quickly closed the gallery app on my phone. Evan's messages were still there even though I hadn't replied. Mark walked in with a grocery bag in one hand and the mail in the other. He said he thought we should have dinner together. I said sure, like it wasn't strange for him to suggest that on a random Thursday. He made pasta again, but this time he added shrimp. I complimented him, said he should have been a chef. He smiled a little. I couldn't tell if it was genuine or practiced. He asked how work was. I said busy. He said I'd mentioned a new client downtown, and I almost choked. I nodded, said something vague about a branding pitch. He looked at me for a second too long, then went back to stirring the sauce. After dinner, we sat in silence. He scrolled through his phone while I pretended to watch a show. When he got up to put his dishes in the sink, I heard a faint vibration from his pocket, a notification sound I didn't recognize. He glanced at it, turned the phone face down, and kept washing. I asked if it was work. He said something personal. I wanted to ask more, but I didn't. The last thing I needed was to look suspicious. Instead, I joked that he was probably planning a surprise for me. He gave a small, polite laugh, the kind people give when they're humoring someone. I told myself he was just tired. Later that night, after he'd gone upstairs, I noticed something odd on his laptop. It was open to a spreadsheet again, but this one looked different. Color-coded tabs, one of them labeled Archive. I scrolled for a second, my heart pounding. There were names of folders, dates, and times, but nothing that made sense. I heard footsteps and quickly closed it, pretending to look for a charger. Mark appeared at the doorway, calm as always. He said, "Can't sleep?" I said, "Just looking for my charger." He nodded, then added, "You should back up your files. Computers crash sometimes." I smiled weakly, unsure what he meant. When he left, I noticed the faint smell of printer toner coming from the guest room. By the next morning, his calmness had started to feel like a wall. I told myself he was just introverted, that all husbands go through quiet phases, but something had changed. He stopped asking about my day. He started keeping his phone face down on the counter, and when he took calls, he'd step outside. I tried to fix it by being cheerful, by acting normal. I suggested a movie night. He said he had a personal errand. I asked what kind. He said, the kind that keeps things in order. I laughed because I didn't know what else to do. When I got to work, I spent the morning pretending to design while scrolling through Evan's old texts. It wasn't even about him anymore. It was about the attention, the reminder that I was still someone worth looking at. I wanted to delete the messages but couldn't. Deleting would make it real, like I was confessing guilt to myself. At lunch, I saw a missed call from unknown. No voicemail. When I told myself it was probably spam, I didn't believe it. I thought of the night before, of Mark's quiet tone. Maybe he'd found something, maybe not. That evening, when I got home, he was in the living room typing on his laptop. I tried to peek, but the screen faced away. He said he'd ordered dinner. I thanked him, said it was sweet. He didn't respond. The delivery arrived and we ate in front of the TV. He didn't even glance at the screen, just chewed slowly, focused. At one point, Ethan ran in from his room with a drawing he'd made. It was of the three of us, me, Mark and him, standing by a big yellow sun. Mark smiled softly and told him it was beautiful. I looked at it and said, "You made my hair too long." Mark didn't laugh. He just said, "It's close enough." When Ethan left, Mark turned the volume down. "You've been busy lately," he said. I shrugged. "Work's been demanding." He nodded once. "Downtown meetings?" I swallowed. "Yes, sometimes." He didn't press further. That scared me more than anger would have. He got up, walked to the counter, and wrote something in his notebook. I asked what it was. He said, "Reminders." After he went upstairs, I walked over and looked at the page. Just lines of words, neat handwriting. One caught my eye. "Friday, verify statements." I didn't understand what it meant. Statements of what? The next day at work, I met my friend Maya for lunch. I told her Mark was acting strange, distant, like he was playing some secret game I wasn't invited to. She said maybe he was stressed. I said maybe he was hiding something. She gave me a look, the kind that says you already know the answer but don't want to say it. When I got home, the house was dark. I turned on the light and saw a small stack of papers on the dining table. Not documents, just receipts, gas, groceries, one from a notary service. I picked them up, confused. Who even uses notaries for personal things anymore? Then I noticed the sound, the faint hum of the printer again. It came from the guest room. I walked toward it slowly. Through the slightly open door, I saw Mark standing by the desk, feeding a page into a small scanner. The light moved across the glass. His back was straight, movements careful. I froze in the hallway, unsure if I should go in or turn away. He must have heard me because he said, without turning, "Paperwork." I forced a laugh. "You're acting like an accountant," he said. "Someone has to keep track of things." I asked, "What things?" He said, "History." He turned then, and our eyes met. I smiled, weakly, as if I hadn't just betrayed him. He gave a small nod, then picked up the folder labeled Utilities and closed the drawer. The lock clicked softly. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept checking my phone, half expecting a message from Evan, half fearing one from Mark. None came. Around midnight, I heard movement downstairs, the soft scrape of a chair, the faint click of a keyboard. I tiptoed to the stairwell and looked down. Mark was at the table, a small lamp lighting his face. He was scanning through his phone, pausing occasionally, then taking photos of something in his notebook. I whispered his name, but he didn't respond. I went back to bed, my heart thudding. I told myself he was just organizing bills, that this was normal. But when I woke up at dawn, he was gone again. On the counter were the two mugs, his clean, mine half full, and a sticky note beside them. Just one word this time. Progress. By the time the weekend came, I was already feeling restless, a little impatient with the slow crawl of normal life. I told myself I needed to focus on work, but every project felt dull, unimportant. Mark continued his usual routine. Wake early, coffee, emails, gym, work, but there was a precision to it that unsettled me. He didn't confront me, didn't ask questions. He just moved like a shadow in the house, leaving small signs of order behind him, like the world was being rearranged without my permission. I decided to meet a few friends at the rooftop bar downtown. It was a warm evening, the kind that invites laughter and the subtle intoxication of attention. I dressed carefully, choosing a dress that was professional but still caught the light in a flattering way. I wanted to be noticed, not just by friends, but by myself, the version of me that had once felt alive and admired. When I arrived, my friends were already there, laughing at inside jokes and holding glasses of sparkling water. I slid into a seat beside them, exchanging smiles and small talk. I told them about the new campaign at work, embellishing a few details, just enough to make it sound impressive. They leaned in, laughing at my excitement, and I felt a rush of that old familiar power. Everyone listening to me, hanging on my words, it was intoxicating. Somewhere across the rooftop, I saw Evan. He wasn't supposed to be there. I hadn't mentioned our meeting to anyone, but here he was, leaning casually against the railing, scanning the city skyline. My heart skipped. I told myself he was just a coincidence, that it didn't matter. I didn't go to him immediately. Instead, I let the energy of the bar carry me, letting the laughter and attention mask the small, insistent beat in my chest that reminded me of him. I chatted with friends about weekend plans, giving playful accounts of the projects I had managed at work, my voice animated and loud enough to draw a few glances from other patrons. They asked about Mark, and I told them he was fine, busy with work. I didn't mention the coffee meeting or the hotel, or the tension that had been quietly building. It wasn't a lie exactly. He was fine, just not present. When Evan finally approached, I felt a surge of anticipation. I told myself it would be casual, a quick hello, a polite chat. He smiled at me and commented on the city lights, as if nothing in the past few years had happened. I nodded and said it was beautiful, but I could feel my pulse quickening. This wasn't just nostalgia, it was the reminder of what I had once been, someone who could make someone notice her without effort. We exchanged small talk, careful words about work and mutual acquaintances. I told him about a client I had worked with downtown, exaggerating a little to make the story sound more impressive. He listened, nodding, smiling, encouraging me. I realized I had been starved for this, the quiet attention, the acknowledgement that I mattered outside of the domestic routine. Meanwhile, Mark's absence was a constant presence in my mind. I imagined him at home, his coffee still warm on the counter, his tasks completed with meticulous care. I told myself I was justified, that I had earned a little attention, a little recognition for who I was, and for the life I was still trying to maintain under the weight of monotony. After half an hour, Evan leaned closer under the guise of checking a text. His shoulder brushed mine. It was subtle, almost accidental, but I felt it, the small spark of something I had not allowed myself to feel for months. I didn't move away. I told myself it was harmless. A touch, a reminder, nothing more. My friends began laughing at a story I was telling, and the spell broke. I excused myself, walking toward the railing to catch my breath, to regain a sense of normality. Evan stayed behind, watching me, his expression unreadable. I felt a thrill, a mix of guilt and desire, and told myself it was just attention, nothing serious. Later, I returned to the group and noticed a few of our co-workers had arrived. They waved, came over to greet me, and I laughed with them, feeling the warmth of recognition again. I posted a photo to my story, smiling, the city lights behind me, pretending everything was casual. Comments and likes came almost immediately. I screenshot them, saving the affirmation like a shield against the quiet judgment I feared from home. By the time I left the bar, the air had cooled, and the city lights blurred into soft streaks as I drove home. I kept thinking about Mark, about his calmness, about the way he had not questioned me, not yet, but had made it clear with his distance that he was aware of more than I had realized. Back at home, the house was quiet. The hum of the refrigerator and the faint ticking of the clock were louder than the city outside. I poured a glass of wine, telling myself it was to relax, to unwind from the long day. My phone vibrated. Evan, a message. Couldn't stay long, but seeing you was good. I felt a thrill, a little pang of excitement I hadn't allowed myself to feel in months. I typed back casually, "Yeah, good to see you." Deleted it immediately. A small act, insignificant, but it made my heart pound in a way I could not ignore. Mark arrived soon after, earlier than I expected. He walked in, carrying a small grocery bag, shoes quiet on the floor. His gaze swept the room, calm and assessing. He asked if I'd eaten. I said yes, a simple pasta from earlier in the evening. He nodded, set the bag on the counter, and moved toward the living room. I felt the familiar rush of guilt. I told myself it was okay, that nothing had happened, that I was still faithful in all the ways that mattered. He didn't challenge me, didn't ask for details. He simply moved around the house with that quiet presence, placing things neatly in their proper place. A mail envelope here, a notebook there. I tried to engage him, asking about his day, his work, the project he'd mentioned on Monday. He answered politely, but his eyes were elsewhere, scanning, noting. I could sense the distance, but I told myself it was just tiredness, just the rhythm of a long week. Later, Ethan came in from his room, rubbing his eyes. I crouched to greet him, asked about his homework. Mark sat quietly beside me, smiling softly at his son, offering gentle corrections without a word to me. I felt a sting of envy, both at the attention Mark gave our son and at the calm that I could not penetrate. After Ethan went to bed, I sat on the couch scrolling through my phone again, looking at photos from the rooftop bar, my friends, laughing, the city glowing behind us. I smiled at the memories, trying to convince myself that everything was harmless. But then, I noticed the faint light under the door of the guest room, a low hum, almost imperceptible. Printer? Scanner? I couldn't tell. I crept closer, peeking through the slightly open door. Mark was there, standing at his desk, moving papers carefully through a small scanner. He glanced at me briefly, said only, "Paperwork." I laughed nervously, said it sounded official. He didn't respond. Later that night, I noticed a small envelope on the dining table. Inside were receipts, some mundane, like groceries, but one from a bank with a small stamp that read, "Verified." My stomach twisted. It didn't make sense, yet it did. This wasn't anger, not yet. This was preparation. When I went to bed, Mark had already turned off the lights. I lay there, pretending to sleep, listening for the quiet sounds of his movement, the faint click of a drawer, the rustle of paper. He was meticulous, calm, deliberate. I felt a twinge of fear mixed with desire, a strange longing for the man I once thought I understood. I knew I had to be careful now. One wrong step, one careless text, and everything I had left, our life, our image, our son, could unravel. I told myself it was okay, that I could navigate this, that I was clever enough to manage both attention and secrecy. The next morning, I found a new note on the counter, written in Mark's neat hand. Follow up. No explanation. Just the word. I stared at it for a long time, trying to decide if I should ignore it or acknowledge it. I chose the former. I couldn't admit to myself that he knew, that he was tracking, documenting, planning. I told myself it was just a reminder for errands. By midday, I was restless again, back at work, pretending to focus while my mind replayed each interaction from the night before. Every glance, every gesture, every unspoken word between Evan and me. I told myself it was harmless, a fleeting indulgence in attention I had been starved of. But the small signs of Mark's preparation gnawed at me in a way I couldn't name. When I got home that evening, the house was quiet again, deceptively calm. I poured myself a drink, thinking I could relax, but my hands shook slightly. I noticed the printer was humming softly. I hadn't realized he still had it on. A blank page slid out. I picked it up, scanning it nervously. Nothing was written, yet I felt its significance. Mark appeared in the hallway, calm, controlled. He didn't look angry, didn't raise his voice. He simply placed his mug on the counter opposite mine, as always, and said, "You should sleep." His tone wasn't a command, not quite. It was more measured, deliberate. I stared at him, unsure if I should apologize, explain, or pretend ignorance. He nodded once and went upstairs, leaving me with the cold echo of control and the faint smell of toner. I sat on the couch for hours, replaying every interaction in my head. The messages I'd sent, the encounters I'd justified, the small spark of attention I craved. It all seemed insignificant, yet heavy. I realized I wasn't just treading water anymore. I was standing on the edge, and Mark had already started building the walls beneath me. When I finally went to bed, I left my phone untouched, unread. I couldn't bring myself to check for Evan's messages. I told myself ignorance was safety. But as I lay there, staring at the ceiling, I knew it was only a matter of time before the careful calm I had ignored turned into something undeniable. The quiet hum of the house, the careful alignment of mugs, the faint click of locks. They weren't just habits anymore. They were a warning, and I, in my foolish confidence, had yet to understand the scope of what I had set in motion. The weekend after the rooftop evening felt heavier than I expected. I kept replaying every glance, every word with Evan, convincing myself it was harmless, that nothing had truly happened. Still, the tension in the house was almost tangible. Mark had been quieter than usual, not absent, not aloof, just precise and methodical in a way that made me uneasy. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was overreacting, but the faint hum of the printer in the guest room, the carefully aligned notebooks, the sticky notes I hadn't placed, everything pointed to the same truth. He was aware, and he was watching. I went to work Monday morning with a sense of urgency, pretending to focus on the client pitch while my mind replayed every step of the previous weekend. I checked Evan's messages for reassurance but found none. That absence made my chest tighten, though I told myself it was a good sign. He wasn't blowing up my phone, so maybe I hadn't crossed a line. After lunch, I had a quick call with a colleague about a downtown meeting. As I ended the call, I glanced at the calendar reminder on my phone. Follow-up 9:25 a.m. downtown. My stomach fluttered. That was the same time Mark had noted last week, the time he somehow always knew things were happening without asking. I tried to convince myself it was coincidence, that he couldn't possibly know everything, but a small, nagging voice whispered otherwise. Later that evening, we attended a garden party at his mother's house. Lydia always had a way of making events feel like family gatherings, even when the tension simmered under the surface. I smiled, poured drinks, and mingled, trying to control the narrative. I told a few relatives that Mark had been busy with work projects downtown. They nodded politely. I caught myself embellishing, making his absence sound intentional, like he was a hard-working man of consequence rather than someone quietly calculating. Evan wasn't at the party, thankfully. That relieved some of the anxiety I had been carrying, but it didn't erase the unease. I found myself overcompensating, joking loudly, telling stories that made me the center of attention. At one point, I laughed about the hotel visit, calling it an old memory, nothing serious. The words slipped out before I could stop them. I noticed a few glances that lingered too long, and I laughed again, louder this time. Mark's silence was like gravity. He stood nearby, sipping his drink, eyes scanning without obvious focus. He didn't confront me, didn't accuse. He simply observed, his quiet presence heavy. I tried to involve him in conversation, asked about his work casually, but he deflected with one-word answers, polite but empty. I felt the need to assert control, to make everyone see that nothing was wrong, that I was just confident, lively, and unafraid to command attention. Clara cornered me later, pulling me aside near the garden fountain. "Iris," she said quietly, eyes narrowing, "you're pushing it too far. He knows something. You need to stop before it gets worse." I waved her off, laughing, telling her she was overreacting, that Mark was just serious, not suspicious. "You always see plots where there are none," I said. She didn't argue, just shook her head, clearly unconvinced. After the party, we drove home in silence. The streets glimmered with city lights, reflecting off the car windows. I tried to break the quiet with small talk about Ethan, about work, about anything to draw him into conversation. He answered politely, but without engagement. When I glanced at him, I noticed the faint glow of his phone on the dashboard. A thread titled, blinked briefly before he turned it off. I tried to ignore it, told myself I was imagining meaning in it. At home, the house was quiet again, the kind of silence that feels heavy with unsaid things. I poured a glass of wine, sat at the kitchen counter, and tried to relax. But the neatness of the space reminded me that Mark had been here, organizing, aligning, noting. My mug sat on one side of the counter, his empty mug on the other, the invisible line between us more defined than ever. Ethan came in, yawning and rubbing his eyes. I crouched to greet him, asking about homework and his day at school. Mark sat nearby, helping him with his reading, correcting mistakes gently, guiding without fuss. I watched them, a pang of jealousy mixing with guilt. I wanted his attention to be mine again, not his son's. I told myself I deserved it too, that I had been careful, that a single hotel meeting didn't erase years of marriage. When Ethan went to bed, Mark remained in the living room, quietly typing into his notebook. I could see the soft glow of his screen through the half-open door of the guest room. He glanced up briefly, acknowledging me without a word, and continued writing. I walked closer, curiosity and apprehension mixed together, but stopped when I saw the neat columns, dates, times, and small notes that I could not fully decipher. I asked him softly what he was doing. He said, "Keeping track." "Of what?" I asked. "History," he replied simply. I laughed lightly, trying to diffuse my own anxiety. "History? Like the museum kind, or—" He didn't answer. He simply turned the page and continued writing, calm, deliberate, meticulous. I tried to remind myself that he hadn't confronted me. He hadn't shouted or accused. That should have been comforting, but instead, it made the tension worse. The careful precision, the silent observation, the tiny reminders of control, it all felt like a warning I was not ready to read. That night, I stayed on the couch, wine glass in hand, scrolling through photos of the party, the city lights behind my friends. The laughter captured in snapshots felt like armor, like proof that I was still vibrant, still noticed, still alive, in a way Mark seemed to have forgotten I could be. I posted one to my story, smiling, tagging a friend, and then immediately deleted it, trying to pretend that it was casual. The act didn't soothe me. It only reminded me of the distance, the gap between my actions and Mark's awareness of them. Around midnight, I heard movement in the guest room, the soft hum of the printer or scanner. I peeked through the slightly open door. Mark was there, placing another page into the machine, face illuminated by the soft glow of the desk lamp. He didn't look up when I appeared. He just said, "Paperwork." His voice was calm, flat, deliberate. I laughed nervously. "You're acting like an accountant." "Someone has to keep track of things," he said. I swallowed, unsure what to say. He gave me a measured glance and returned to his task. When he finished, he slid a folder labeled "Bank" into a locked drawer. The click of the lock echoed in the quiet house. I told myself it didn't matter, that it was just organization, just habit. But when I went to bed later, I lay awake, thinking about the weekend, the hotel, Evan, the party, and Mark's calm presence. I realized that my careful justifications, the story I had told myself about attention, nostalgia, and harmless meetings, were fragile. The small, deliberate acts Mark performed in silence suggested awareness, preparation, and patience far beyond anything I could control. I drifted off, restless, imagining the spreadsheet, the notes, the sequence of events that Mark had quietly aligned. I knew I was being observed, measured, documented, and that my illusions of harmlessness were slipping through my fingers. For the first time, I understood that the consequences were not coming with shouting or confrontation. They were being built quietly, patiently, meticulously, while I believed I was still in control. The house was silent when I finally slept. the faint glow of the city lights through the windows casting long shadows across the floor. I told myself I could handle this, that I could manage attention, desire, and secrecy, but somewhere deep down, I knew I was no longer the one shaping the story. Mark was, and he was patient. When morning came, the kitchen was empty, the mugs placed exactly where they belonged. A sticky note lay beside his, handwritten in his neat script. Bring forms. I stared at it, uncertain, but trying to convince myself it was just a reminder, nothing more. I knew, even then, that this was the quiet before a storm I had invited, and that every step I had taken had been leading to it. By the middle of the week, I had convinced myself that Mark's silence was finally easing. Maybe he had accepted that I needed attention outside the routines we had built. Maybe he understood that a single meeting, one brief afternoon with Evan, didn't define my loyalty. I clung to the illusion, telling myself that calm observation was a form of forgiveness, that he had chosen to let me continue living in my small bubble of excitement. I tried to be pleasant, asking him about his day, laughing lightly at jokes he didn't fully commit to. I told him about the new client downtown, embellishing the story just enough to make it sound impressive. He listened, nodded, offered the occasional acknowledgement, and I took it as a sign that everything was moving back to normal. At home, I arranged the living room for dinner, placing Ethan's small chair near the table and setting out plates. I tried to anticipate Mark's preferences, even though I had grown tired of guessing at the patterns of his days. I wanted to appear attentive, to show that I was considerate, that I was aware of what mattered to him. It felt like an act, and maybe it was. When he arrived, he noticed the arrangement without comment. He set his bag down neatly, took a quick glance at the kitchen counter, and then poured himself a cup of coffee. The mugs were spaced as usual, his on the left, mine on the right. I had noticed the pattern months ago, but now it felt like a barrier rather than habit. I smiled, trying to lighten the mood. He nodded politely and began his work on the laptop, the faint hum of electronics filling the room. I asked him casually if he had anything scheduled for the evening. He said only that there were errands, nothing unusual, though his tone carried an undertone I didn't quite catch. I pressed no further, telling myself it was better not to probe. After dinner, I tried to engage him in conversation, teasing lightly about work and the city lights outside. He responded, polite but measured, his attention never fully on me. I felt the familiar pang of frustration, but I told myself patience was part of the game. I had always considered myself clever, capable of bending situations to my advantage. This was no different, just another test to navigate. Later that night, I noticed him moving about quietly, as he often did. He was checking something on his phone, then writing briefly in a notebook. I peered toward the desk in the guest room. The folder marked Utilities was open, neatly arranged, lines and notes precise. I told myself it was nothing, that he was simply being thorough, preparing for mundane tasks. But the calculated movements, the quiet attention to detail, made my pulse quicken. When he finally looked up, I asked him what he was working on. He said softly, "Keeping things in order." "Order?" I asked, feigning casual curiosity. "Yes," he said. "Properly, so nothing gets lost." I tried to laugh, to make the moment feel light. I said it sounded bureaucratic, like something a clerk in a government office might do. He simply smiled faintly, not condescending, not hostile, just calm. That faint smile unsettled me more than anger ever could. In the following days, I noticed a few small changes that I tried to ignore. A locked drawer in his desk, a subtle hum of the printer at odd hours, a USB taped underneath a folder labeled with a date. Nothing overt, nothing that I could confront him about, yet everything spoke volumes. He was preparing. I didn't know for what exactly, but the quiet precision was impossible to dismiss. I continued my work and social routines as usual, meeting friends for lunch and happy hour. I laughed, posted pictures to social media, curated a persona that was bright and confident, untouchable. My friends commented, admired, and I drank in the attention like water, telling myself it was necessary, that I had earned a little life outside the walls of quiet domesticity. One evening, after returning home, I noticed the guest room door slightly ajar. I peeked inside. Mark was at the desk, typing quietly, then pausing to make small notes in a separate notebook. I moved closer, curious, but stopped short when I saw how meticulous he was. He noticed me, looked up briefly, and said, "You should rest." "Rest?" I repeated, trying to keep my tone light. "I'm fine." "You've been busy," he said simply. "It's better to pause than rush." I nodded, uncertain, and went to the couch. The hum of the printer started again, then stopped. A sheet of paper lay half ejected, blank. I told myself it was random, that I was overthinking patterns where none existed. But even as I lay there, pretending to relax, I knew something had shifted. That night, Mark came upstairs after I had already prepared for bed. He placed his mug on the nightstand opposite mine, as usual, and said nothing more. I turned away, pretending to sleep, but I could hear him moving in the guest room again. The soft click of the drawer lock, the faint shuffle of papers. The following morning, I woke to find the kitchen neat and empty. The mugs were in place, his clean, mine half full. On the counter lay a sticky note in his precise handwriting. "Bring forms." I stared at it, trying to convince myself it was merely a reminder. But the small details, the neat handwriting, the precise placement, the calm authority, made my chest tighten. I tried to engage him during breakfast, asking about his day and errands. He answered politely, one-word phrases, measured, careful. I pressed no further. The distance was deliberate. I could feel it, a quiet assertion of control that I hadn't anticipated. Later that day, I went to meet friends for an afternoon coffee, just to maintain my sense of normalcy. I laughed, recounted stories from work, and tried to ignore the small knot of anxiety growing in my stomach. Notifications popped up on my phone from Evan, though I did not reply. I told myself that was wise. The fewer messages, the less exposure, the smaller the chance I would be caught in something beyond harmless attention. Returning home, the house was silent. I poured a drink and sat at the counter, noticing again the small details. The neat alignment of papers, the faint hum of the electronics, the subtle signs of order in his absence. I told myself I was overreacting, that his precision was simply habit, not intent. Mark arrived shortly after, carrying a small grocery bag. He placed it on the counter with deliberate care and moved toward the living room. I tried to engage him in conversation, light and playful, but he remained polite and reserved, his attention divided. When Ethan ran in from his room, Mark shifted seamlessly into the role of father, guiding him with calm patience. I watched silently, a pang of envy mixed with guilt rising in my chest. After Ethan went to bed, Mark returned to his desk in the guest room, moving quietly among papers and folders. I sat on the couch, wine glass in hand, pretending to read, but my mind replayed the events of the past week. The hotel, the party, the attention, and Mark's calm, deliberate observation. The quiet actions, the careful preparation, the soft hum of the printer, and the click of the drawer lock all pointed to one truth I could not fully face. Mark was preparing for something. When he finally came upstairs, he placed his mug on the nightstand, his gaze steady. I whispered something about sleep, trying to keep the moment light. He nodded once, calmly, and left the room. I lay awake for hours, imagining what he had been documenting, what sequences he had been aligning, and what might come next. The next morning, a new calendar reminder glowed on my phone. Courthouse lobby, 9:30. My chest tightened, though I tried to convince myself it was an appointment for errands. But the quiet, deliberate pattern of Mark's recent actions was no longer a minor curiosity. It was a warning I could no longer ignore. When I poured coffee, I noticed the mugs were again spaced deliberately across the counter. Beside his, a small envelope sat with my name on it. I hesitated before picking it up. Inside, neatly stacked, were forms, receipts, and notes I could barely comprehend. I told myself it was mundane, that it was just paperwork, but the precision, the order, and the calm with which it was presented made my pulse race. That morning, Mark looked at me across the table, his expression neutral, almost serene. "Iris," he said softly, "I'll handle it properly." I froze. His words were calm, lacking anger, lacking accusation, but the weight behind them pressed down like a physical force. I told myself he meant nothing, that it was a reassurance, a promise to move past the weekend. But even as I nodded, smiling weakly, I knew it was something else entirely, something deliberate, something final. I continued my morning routine, but I was distracted, aware of the subtle signals, the careful notes, the quiet preparation he had undertaken over the past week. Every action, every calculated gesture, pointed toward a moment I could not control, and I knew that moment would arrive soon. I tried to convince myself I was clever enough, that I could still maneuver through this, charm my way out of any consequence. But deep down, I felt the first real tremor of fear. Mark was no longer observing. He was ready, and I, in all my careful planning and self-justification, had left myself exposed. The courthouse lobby was crowded with people, the air tense and sterile. Mark stood beside me calmly, his hand holding a thick envelope. He looked me in the eye and said, "This starts today." I took the papers, my fingers trembling. Divorce petition, temporary custody, and financial orders, all formal, all final. The clerk confirmed service, and just like that, everything I had tried to control unraveled.